I'll present part of a vocabulary for describing content generation in games, and I think some of that extends probably a bit beyond games. Give two examples of complete, for some definition of the word complete, tools that I've worked on, Tanagra and Endless Web, talk about evaluation, and then, if there's time, talk about some of the in-progress work that we have and some of the future work that I'm hoping to do. So what I'm interested in with procedural content generation is looking at why and how it is used in games. So some traditional motivations for procedural content generation in games have been using it as a form of data compression. So in the game Elite, all of the galaxies in that world are procedurally generated by the computer, but it's entirely deterministic. And the designers actually had sort of curatorial control over what showed up in the final version of the game. So it was generated by the computer, but then they held the random seed steady and did a little bit of editing around that. So they really wanted to be able to have massive worlds for players to explore, but didn't have the disk space, or I think even disks, right? Back when that game came out. So they didn't have any storage space. The motivation that we probably most commonly hear for procedural content generation in sort of my corner of the research community is introducing replayability into games. So every time you go into a game, there's a fresh new experience for the player, and it's very exciting, and it makes it so players want to come back and again and practice out different strategies in new environments every time. And there's an avenue of research that looks at personalization in content generation. So can we generate levels for games that perfectly match what players need to get out of the game, either in sort of the educational sphere, maybe to be able to generate things for sort of personalized learning, so where the learner currently is, can you generate content that is perfect for them to be able to learn more? In the entertainment sphere, it might be, if the player is doing very badly, can we give them content that's a little bit easier? If the player is doing very well, can we give them content that's a little bit harder? So these are three broad motivations. And as I said, the one that's really the most commonly talked about is replay. And I think replay is interesting and also not entirely my motivation, and I'm going to tell you why. Because there's a lot of reasons that we replay games, and not all of them are to do with procedural content generation. Right? So these are 4 games that I have replayed time and time again, and I replay them for different reasons. Right? I replay Halo as something fun to do with my husband on co-op play, right? And it's just a fun thing for us to sit down, blow off some steam together playing Halo. I've replayed all of the Monkey Island games too many times to count because of the nostalgia value, right? I've replayed Dragon Age because of its story. Even replaying the same story and over and over and over again, just the romance line with Alistair in particular is so good that I replay it for the same reason that I reread a book that I've enjoyed. Right? And I think probably a lot of us grew up playing board games with family and friends, and we replay those games, and there's really no sense of procedural content generation in any of these games. You could kind of argue it for Scrabble because there's randomness in how you draw the tiles, but it's a loose association, and I think most people would kind of not really consider that content generation. So I'm really interested in looking in procedural content generation beyond this idea of replayability and what content generation can bring to design experiences, and what we need to be thinking about when designing creative algorithms to produce content for games or other forms of media, to be able to have sort of authentic design reasons for doing it beyond this very shallow notion of of course, if you have lots of content, people will replay your game. Because newsflash, if your game is bad, it doesn't matter how much procedural content generation is in it, people are still not going to play it. So what I'm interested in is being able to have an ability to generate interesting content, have an ability to generate meaningful content that's meaningful to the design experience. Interesting is a word that is deliberately ill-defined in this presentation. I'm interested in the ability to actually look at how you design content generators, not just develop content generators, and how to actually understand what content generators are capable of creating, and what that means for being able to create new ones. So the work that I've been doing sort of fits into what I've been calling expressive design tools. So I'm interested in creating systems imbued with an understanding of game design, although some of my newer work is, we can ignore the word game here, that are sufficiently controllable and expressive for use in the design process. And I'm going to go through the 3 bolded words and talk about what specifically I mean by that. And let's start by an idea of being able to control a content generator. So you can kind of boil down procedural content generation research, and I imagine lots of sort of generative design research, into 3 stages, right? There's this sort of algorithm that could potentially sit in a black box that tries to sort of boil down human knowledge of design in some way to be able to produce things. So these are some of my students hanging out designing a game. Like, wouldn't it be cool if we could take what they're doing and like make an algorithm that does that? And I think that's probably the focus of a lot of the people in this room, is trying to do something like that. But there's also input to that box and output from that box, right? So we give input to the algorithm in the form of some kind of design control, and output from it in the form of a space of content that can be created by the algorithm. And a lot of research in the procedural content generation community really focuses on what's going on inside this box, right? Because it's hard to capture design knowledge and be able to like produce an algorithm to do it, and there's lots of really interesting research in different kinds of techniques to do that, and it's really fun to work on that. And I've done lots of work in that space as well, but what I'm becoming increasingly interested in is what sits outside of that box, right? What kind of input can you give to content generators, and how can we characterize the kind of output that comes from them in order to better understand, right, what we can do inside of the box, right? So this talk is going to largely focus on what the inputs and the outputs to content generation. And so to be able to describe the inputs, I did some research doing a design-focused analysis of content generation in games, looking at all of the different ways that content generation has been used and how either designers or players or both interact with those systems. And the analysis that I did was building on the mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics framework for analyzing games. How many of you have heard of that before? Okay, so the rough idea is that the mechanics of the game are the rules. Those are the things that we as developers and designers control and author ourselves. The aesthetics are the reason why it is that the game is fun to play, right? Maybe it's fun because of discovery, or fun because it's challenging, or fun because it invokes a feeling of fellowship. But sort of the aesthetic experience that you want players to have when engaging with what you've created. And then the dynamics of this fuzzy thing that sit in the middle between the two, right, that we have no control over, but the ways in which the mechanics that you've defined interact with each other, and the player interacts with those mechanics to be able to produce an aesthetic experience. So I went through a lot of different games and tools that use procedural content generation to try to come up with a vocabulary based on this framework to be able to describe different systems. And I have a whole paper that does it from all 3 angles. In this talk, I'm just going to be looking at the different mechanical ways that content generators can work and how you can interface with them. So there's really 4 main things we want to consider with procedural content generation when talking about how it works and how it can be controlled by a designer. The first is sort of the knowledge representation component. Right? What level, what style of building block are we really using when we're designing generative systems? And systems can run the gamut from what I'm calling experiential chunks, so large human-authored segments of gameplay that then are pieced together in a relatively lightweight way, right? So, maybe large segments of levels for a platformer game that a human has authored to be able to get a particular kind of experience for the player to have during that chunk, and then they're just randomly placed next to each other. And this runs the gamut all the way from those large experiential chunks down to an actual internal subcomponent representation of content. So for a platformer level, we said big human-authored sections of a level would be experiential chunks. A subcomponent would be a tile with no semantic knowledge attached to it. or even like a pixel with no semantic knowledge attached to it, right? So we can look at how we as designers of generative systems are representing knowledge in these ways, and how we're sort of encoding aspects of design knowledge, right? Because if we're using large experiential chunks, then all of the design knowledge is really still in the human who's creating the system. If we're using subcomponents, then you need to have some way to express design knowledge in the algorithm, right? And these are very different ways of being able to control a generative system that lead to different kinds of experiences that you can get as a result. It's also important to look, in games especially, at what stage mechanically the content generation is happening, right? Is it happening before the game even begins? Or is it happening during the game, so the system needs to be able to respond to what players are doing? And this has a big impact on how you design the system and also the kinds of experiences you can get out of a particular kind of system. And then two things I'm particularly interested in, the kind of interaction that a human can have with the content generation system. So is there a level of influence that a human can have over the generation algorithm, and what type of influence is that? So is it parameterized, where you can say I want a level that has 50% of the challenges in it are enemies and 30% of the challenges will be springs, like go and like try to meet those parameters in some way? Is it preference-based, so something like pick breeder or endless forms? These are systems where a human is controlling the content generation flow based on stating different preferences, right? I like this kind of content. I don't like this kind of content. Show me more that's like this. Show me less that's like that. So it's a very indirect form of interacting with the generator that can produce certain kinds of tool-like experiences. And then there's the idea of direct manipulation, right? Can a human actually go in and have a conversation with the generator, right, to directly manipulate the content that's being made? Spore Creature Creator is a good example of this, right, where the human is like directly editing exactly the same model that the computer is directly editing. And then within that level of interaction, we can talk about the extent to which that interaction can have control over the experience a player will have in a game that uses the content generation. So can you set parameters for the appearance of content but not explicitly set parameters for the kinds of experience a player might have? So you can say, I want there to be 50% enemies and 20% gaps, but you can't necessarily say, I want this to be a difficult level or an easy level, because there are levels you can have with different combinations of components, but it's the ordering of those components that actually makes a difference on experience. So we can also look at content generators in those terms and describe them in those terms. So a couple of different examples of this. We can look at a game like Spelunky. How many of you have played or seen Spelunky? Those of you who haven't should go play it, because it's awesome. It's a cave exploration game with procedurally generated cave levels. And this is a system that uses large experiential chunks, so large pre-authored sections of a level that it pieces together. And then a second pass of the generation algorithm places smaller components into it. All generation happens offline before the game begins. The human player and the human designer have no influence and no kind of interaction with the generator at all. And I'll be talking about a particular tool that I worked on Tanagra, which I skipped over on this slide. I'll talk about it in those later as well. But first, I want to have a brief aside about math. And what it is that I mean by experiential control. So a lot of the time I think it's tempting to say that experiential control can boil down to like, how fun is the level going to be? I want a level that is 0.79 fun or 0.33 fun, as though, I don't know, that's a quantifiable thing. And so I want to be very clear that when I'm talking about experiential control, I don't mean the kind of experiential control where you like try to boil down everything about your experience into a single number, using some bizarre equation that makes my inner artist cry kind of a lot. What I'm actually talking about is being able to give sort of meaningful semantic experiential control to a designer. This could be something like being able to have explicit control over the pacing of a level, or the flow of a quest and when you meet characters, how challenges progress over time, different kinds of gameplay constraints, like I want there to be a building, and I want there to be a hill, and I want the top of the hill to be visible from the top of the building, so that the player has the experience of being able to go up to the top of the building and have a lookout point to be able to see what's going on the hill. Like, this, in my mind, is experiential control. Being able to say, I want a 0.79 difficulty level is nowhere near a rich enough way of expressing design control to be useful to a designer. So I just want to be clear that that's what I'm talking about there. So now that we've talked about sort of what I mean by control and how mechanically, sort of in the abstract, right, content generation systems can work, I'm going to talk a bit about two specific tools that I worked on well, one is a tool and one is a game, actually, using different content generation systems that intersect, have the human and the computer work together in a meaningful way in the design process. So the first tool that I'm going to talk about is called Tanagra, for which there are nerdy bonus points if anyone knows the reference for the name, why it is that I named it, other than Mike, who I think already knows. Accidentally. So Tanagra is a tool for being able to create 2D platforming levels, kind of like Mario or Sonic the Hedgehog levels. It was initially intended to be generic 2D platforming levels, although looking back on it a few years later, I think that was particularly ambitious of me. Maybe a bit arrogant of me as well, in retrospect. But Tanagra is aiming to solve a particular design problem, which is that the current, or at the time, current level design tools, and actually even still now, level design tools, are really unfriendly to novice designers. They're not super friendly to expert designers either, if we're being honest. These design tools make it very easy to create completely unplayable levels, and what I mean by unplayable is like you put all of the stuff down and you spend forever painstakingly making something, and this is a very common thing for novice designers to do, and then you're like, yes, I'm done, I've made the best level ever, and you hit the play button, and you realize that you can't even jump over the first gap that you've put in. At which point then there's really no automation in place for you to be able to adjust anything. Right now you need to go through and painstakingly move everything that you've done over and make all of the gaps line up correctly, and it's a huge pain in the butt. No one likes to do this, which makes it very hard to prototype ideas, especially for novice designers who may not know that prototyping is even a thing you want to do, right? And they also typically have you start from a blank screen. So the level editor that's on the right, this is a level editor for a game called N, which is a physics-based, ragdoll physics platforming game with bizarre gravity and floating around to be able to collect coins and stuff. And it came with, the option for user-created content, saying yes, we want people to create lots of levels for our game. And then the first thing that happens when you go into the level editor is literally it presents you with an empty gray screen. It's go, make your level. At which point I think a lot of people, some people will be yes, I know what I want to make. But a lot of people are what? I don't even know where to start. Right? So these are the four problems that I wanted to address from a design perspective with designing a tool to be able to help people create levels for games. So Tanagra is a tool that takes a mixed initiative approach. What I mean by that is the human and the computer take turns to be able to create content for the game. The human can pose constraints to the computer. I want the pacing of the level to be fast in the middle and slow at the end. I want these platforms to be here, but I don't really care what goes on in between. So the human can pose constraints, and then the computer in return can suggest content that meets those constraints and suggest lots of different kinds of content that meets those constraints. The human sees it, can say, oh, I like this, I don't like that, pose new constraints, add and remove different constraints. And you sort of work in a cycle between the human and the computer to be able to design a level. What's nice about this mixed initiative approach is it takes a lot of the benefits of procedural content generation, the fact that it can create levels offline relatively quickly. It can generate content within constraints, like constraint solving is a thing. We've got pretty good at it in AI, right? We can enforce level playability, right? Because we know how fast the avatar can run and how high the avatar can jump, and it's relatively simple platforming physics, right? To be able to calculate what is allowed and what is not. And we can and as a result, we can directly model pacing. What's hard in procedural content generation, right, is creating good content. It's very easy to create lots and lots of bad content, but it's much harder to have some kind of aesthetic judgment over what is good content, especially for an individual user whose judgment of aesthetics might be very different from person to person to person. Right, so we wanted to take all of the benefits of content generation and all of the strengths of a human designer, that they have a sense of aesthetics, that they have a sense of creative judgment even if they don't know where to begin, that they kind of have an understanding of what will be easy and what will be hard, and kind of will know what they want when they see it, was the hope. And we did all of that to produce this tool called Tanagra. I wonder if this video will work. Yes, it will. So this is Tanagra running, so you can hit the generate button and it'll generate stuff. You can draw in platforms and hit the generate button to generate what goes in between. And it'll always pin the darker platforms in place that's user created. You can playtest levels in the editor, following along a little timeline on the bottom so you know where in the level you are. And that timeline is actually literally a timeline. Within each box, there is one action that a player will need to take. So you can directly edit the pacing of the level by changing the size and number of those boxes, right, to make it so that more actions need to happen in smaller amounts of space. So you can edit pacing by editing the timeline, regenerate the content that you'll see at any time, always meeting the same constraints as before, drag platforms around, and the rest of the level will morph to meet the constraints that you've given it. Remove constraints if you decide you don't want that anymore, drag it up there. So you can kind of play with the computer in a way, play with the content generator to be able to get to the kind of level that you want to make. And so with Tanagra, what we were aiming for again was sort of removing the blank slate problem. It lets you refocus your testing efforts, so instead of needing to test for playability, now you're testing for fun, which is something that's honestly much more fun to test for. And it provides sort of meta-level editing operations to be able to have novice designers explicitly reason about the pacing of a level, because that's an option that's explicitly given to them, as opposed to not really thinking about it at all, right? It forces a particular kind of design approach onto the user of the tool. So that's Tanagra. The second experience that I worked on that sort of uses an expressive design tool was, instead of looking at how a designer can interact with a content generation system, let's look at how a player can actually interact with a content generation system in a game. So this is really trying to push beyond the replayability thing into, like, what is the game that couldn't exist without procedural content generation in it. So again, this is sort of using the language of the mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics framework, where I posited that, you know, what is the game that couldn't exist without content generation? Well, it's the game where the content generation system is the mechanic of the game, right? It's so intrinsically tied to the mechanics of the game that it would be impossible to make it without it. And it's also so greatly influenced the reason why the player wants to play, right? So greatly influenced the aesthetics of the game, that the dynamics during play revolve around content generation in some way, that the player needs to be able to build strategies around the content generated. So this was a project where we really wanted to design a game that maximizes the impact of procedural content generation beyond just, you know, the replayability argument. But also from a research perspective, this was an interesting project because it's very hard, as I'm sure you've all noticed in computational creativity, right? It's very hard to evaluate what it is that we make, right? Because it's very subjective and it's very, like, context dependent. And so what had happened before embarking on this project is I created sort of the precursor to Tanagra, was a level generation system called Launchpad. And Launchpad is a parameterized content generator. And I think I have a slide on how it works in a little bit. But we made this level generator, and we're like, look, it makes levels, hooray! And we could show, like, look, it makes lots of different kinds of levels. But there wasn't an evaluation that actually showed whether or not those levels that it was making and the style of interaction that a designer could have with it would actually lead to an engaging design experience. So Endless Web, the game I'll be talking about, was in large part conceived as an evaluation of Launchpad. Evaluate the creative system you've built by actually embedding it into a mostly polished, to the extent you can in academia, right? Like finished playable system that other people will actually have to interact with, and look at how that pushes back on the technology decisions you made when you were designing your content generator in a design void. Right? So, sorry, the last slide was a leftover. It's not actually that interesting. So the process that we followed with creating Endless Web is a process that I wrote about in, it actually ended up not being published, I think. We turned it into like a tech report or something. But several other people at the same time were looking at this idea of AI-based game design and what it means to design a game like very deeply around an AI system. And procedural content generation is basically just a subset of AI, right? So the content generation system provided certain affordances onto the game design, right? The kind of content that it could make, the kind of mechanics that we designed into the content generator have certain affordances on the kind of game you could design based on it. And the game design then pushes back on the AI system with a particular kind of context, right? Oh, you're making a platformer level where you want players to be able to like explore, and the more they've explored, the more difficult it gets. Well, you'd better have some kind of notion of difficulty in your level generator, right? Otherwise you have no way of having any kind of experiential control of the kind that you want to be able to give. So Endless Web was definitely followed this kind of design process where we started with an AI system, built an initial pass of a game on it, and that actually informed all of the things that were broken about the AI system, all of the things that really were not doing what we thought they were doing in a useful way, so pushed back on the AI system, and we ended up in this sort of cycle, which we're actually still in a way, because Endless Web is almost done. So it's been in private beta for an embarrassingly long time. In part because I think what it really needs is like one more iteration on the AI system for it to be a successful game. But I think we may just cut our losses at this point and push it out into the world. Mike is laughing because last year I talked to him about Endless Web and told him it was coming out in a month. And that was a lie. It was a horrible, horrible lie. So Launchpad is a rhythm-based level generator, so it was the precursor to Tanagra. It's got a parameterized control type, so as a designer you can tell the system, I want levels that the player needs to take an action on a regular rhythm, so actually like the button on the controller at a regular pace. And it lets you say things like, I want levels with 50% enemies and 30% gaps. Like literally that is its input, is this sort of set of parameters of the kind of content you want. So it gives you both compositional and experiential control in that you can control the appearance of components that will show up in the level, but you can also explicitly control what the pacing of the level should be like. Endless Web uses Launchpad to generate an infinite world for players to explore. So it's a platformer where you can keep running to the right or the left and just like more stuff will be generated out in front of you, and the stuff that's behind you will disappear, right, for memory reasons. But this meant that you can get into this experience in Endless Web where you can run to the right for a while, turn around and run left, and what's there isn't what was just behind you. And so that entire experience really informed the metaphor that we use in the game of you being a character who's exploring a dream world. where turn a corner and what you will encounter is completely different than what you expected you might encounter. So players are exploring what's called the dream, which is sort of humanity's collective dreamscape. And this is where you can tell that I did my graduate work in the central coast of California. So the idea is that all humans, when we fall asleep and dream, we wake up in the world that is in this game. And when we have nightmares, there are these little characters who run around the world that you're controlling in the game, called eidolons. And when you have a nightmare, it disrupts their world, and so their job is sort of to be curators of the world and caretakers of the world rather, run around it, and when they find people who are having nightmares, prod you awake. And so when you wake up in a jolt from having had a nightmare, it's because one of these dudes just poked you with a stick in the dream world. So the way that we wanted players to strategize around strategize around the content generator is to turn this game idea of being able to explore a physical space and have the game actually be about a player exploring the generative space of the system. So the player can interact with special components in the game, sort of glowing versions of them. And when the player interacts with those components, it changes the parameters to the content generation system. So if you jump onto one of these blue glowing springs, it will propel you upwards into newly generated terrain, and that terrain will have more springs in it, more spring-like challenges in it, and more difficult spring-like challenges in it over time. The same for if you interact with this enemy, so jump onto the enemy, you can go up this glowing tube of light that will appear, and you'll see progressively more complex enemies and progressively more of them show up as you move around this space. So for example, with enemies, it starts out that you just see spikes that are static and just static on the ground that you need to jump over. Then you see enemies that patrol platforms. Then you see enemies that patrol platforms while jumping. Then enemies that patrol and shoot things at you. So it gets a little bit harder every time to be able to get past those kinds of enemies. And then dreamers who are having nightmares are hidden in configurations of this six-dimensional generative space. Right? And this is the hardest part of Endless Web, is teaching players how to navigate six-dimensional imaginary space in a two-dimensional game that uses traditional two-dimensional exploration tropes. But your goal is to tune the dream to align with where characters are hidden in the world. So you want to get to the combination where you're at tier 2 difficulty of enemies and tier 1 difficulty of springs and tier 1 difficulty of moving platforms will get you, I forget what it actually gets you. Let's say it gets you to the little girl who's afraid of creepy crawlies, right? And as you explore the space, the generator is creating all of the environments that you'll see, and also attempting to intelligently skin those environments so that as you move around space, the closer you get to dreamers, the more the art style coalesces around that dreamer. So as you get closer to the girl who's afraid of creepy crawlies, the more bug art assets you see in the game. As you get closer to the guy who's afraid of dying alone, the more clocks and Grim Reaper enemies come in. And so the art style is very, very weird. And from a perspective of control over a generator, design control over a generator, this is a really interesting project, because now the designer wants to be able to have control over the experience that the player will have, but you're resting a lot of that control and giving it to the player, right? You're telling the player that they get to choose how difficult all of the content is. They get to choose what kinds of components they'll see. And the designer that we were working with on this was wait, what do I get to control? if the player gets to control everything, then what am I even doing in this game other than wondering why the generator is creating really weird things sometimes. So we ended up making this decision to be able to have this tension between wanting authored control from a designer and wanting player control over their experience. by separating out experiential and compositional control. So the designer, we as designers of the game get to decide how the pacing is going to change over time. The more dreamers you found, the longer pacing the game is going to be, and the more sporadically placed the actions you need to take are going to be to make it a little bit harder. But the player gets to retain compositional control over when different pieces of content appear, and also a little bit of experiential control in that there's difficulty baked into the knowledge representation, right, of different tiers of difficulty of enemies. Let's see if this embedded video works. Yes! So I was using up all of the tech karma to make it so that embedded video would work in my presentation. So this is the beginning of the game when you're trying to find an elder and you go over a very precarious bridge and your entire world goes wrong. And you're told that now there are dreamers who are trapped and it's your job to find them and save them. And presented with this space where the generative space is initially set so that nothing interesting is being generated by the computer. So you're really just running around and there's no gaps, there's no enemies. You kill an enemy, go up, this beam of light is revealed, and now there's all of these spikes that you need to avoid. And that's the only kind of challenge you'll ever see in the game. A different option from there might be that the first thing you do is you go down this tube that's revealed by a stomper, and you land into newly generated terrain where the only kind of challenge you'll see is stompers, right? Because this is the first choice that you've made. And you can keep exploring the space to see more and more stompers. So I've cheated us out a bunch, so in the next content you'll see a bunch of moving platforms, a bunch of stompers, and a bunch of enemies. And so the generator is merging all of these elements together to make it so that you have levels that have all of those elements in approximately the proportions relative to the tiers of difficulty. And when you find a dreamer, you come into a special segment of the game that's actually the only human-authored level structures in the game are the dreamer levels, because we wanted something that the computer wouldn't be capable of creating itself as kind of the reward to the player for finding different things, which rhetorically is a strange thing to say at this point, but we had a good reason for it at the time we designed it, I'm sure. So that's Endless Web. Anyone who wants to play it, you're I will give you the link to download it at this point. We should really just put the link publicly and call it. I don't even know why we haven't. Actually, I do know why we haven't. There is one game-breaking bug in there that we have not been able to find that is a result of the fact that you need to be managing all of where all of the content is, and so because you're exploring a physical space, but the content is changing over time, you hit these interesting problems where if you turn around and the content hasn't been deleted, but new content has been generated over the top of it, then you can get stuck by content from a previous version that you're not supposed to. It's terrible. Anyway, but that doesn't happen super often. So if you want to play, I'm very happy to give you the link. There's really three main things that are being generated in Endless Web. The level segments, obviously, that's what we've talked about so far. Art asset selection, so each dreamer has its own collection of art assets associated with it, and it'll try to intelligently choose art assets to place into the world. It was really fun working with artists on this, by the way, because they freaked out a little bit when they were told you need to make purely modular art that we will recombine in any way we choose and you have no control over it whatsoever. So this has solidified my conviction that one of my future research directions has to be some sense of having art direction in procedural content generation, because the artists were no. We're just not interested in giving you free reign. Basically there's no art direction in this game, right? There's no sense of like visual interestingness that is baked into the generator. It's all like falls out emergently, and sometimes you get really cool stuff, but sometimes you just get like long, boring straightaways that look terrible. I just so unhappy, but that's okay. The other thing we're doing, and this is like not really super intelligent procedural content generation, but we needed some way of being able to like let people wayfind in generative space. And so one of the things that we do is each configuration of the dream has a unique musical fingerprint to it. So each dreamer has their own soundtrack associated, and we layer in the music assets based on where in the dream world you are. So when you're near the Creepy Crawlies dreamer, you'll be hearing very, very different music than when you're near the Time and Death dreamer or the Body Horror dreamer. How are we doing on time, by the way?
I think it's still good, right? We've got another half hour.
Yeah, we have that room.
Yeah.
Let's see.
They are awesome.
All right.
We do 45 minutes.
Okay. I'm almost done with this bit, and then I'm going to talk a bit about the future work, and then there'll be questions. So those are the two sort of finished, for some definition of finished, as I said, projects as examples of expressive design tools. What's left is talking about what exactly it is that I mean by expressivity, right, and how we can evaluate that. It's not really enough when we care about content generation from a design point of view. It's not really enough to be able to say my level generator can create 10,000 unique levels, or 100,000 unique levels, or 1 million unique levels. If they're unique but they all like feel the same in some way, then that's not useful, right? If technically they're all unique because like different platforms are at different pixel coordinates, but they're all basically like levels about jumping over gaps, that's not as expressive a generator in some ways as if you have a generator that is capable of creating a much broader range of styles of challenges, right? So one of the really important things in caring about procedural content generation from a design perspective is about really being able to characterize how expressive a system is and what controlling a system does to that expressivity. So if I say, I want to use these particular parameters, have I now narrowed down my design space so that there's only 2 levels that meet the parameters that I'm giving? Or are there still like 100 levels that are interesting and different enough from each other? Because if you want to use content generation in a designed experience, you need to be able to think about the space of content that a system is going to be producing and how a player is going to interact with that content. So what I'm increasingly interested in is being able to do some kind of expressive range analysis of content generation systems. And this wars a little bit with my art side, because I'm like, I shouldn't need to care about like the expressive range of Van Gogh, right? It's enough that he created some amazing artwork. And so I think this is where my like art and design sides conflict with each other in some ways. But if we go down the design path, right? This is an expressive range map for Launchpad, so the generator that's underlying Endless Web. And what we did was to be able to evaluate this, we generated 20,000 different levels, judged each level on its leniency, which is kind of an objective measure of difficulty. So it's not about how hard any given player will find it, it's more across the entire level, how likely is it that the player will come to death, right? Like, of the challenges that they see, how many of them are instant death if they fail versus like slight setback if they fail. So that's leniency, and then we also looked at linearity, so how much like up and down flow the player will experience as they go through a level. Are they going to feel like they're always climbing a staircase? Are they going to feel like they're on like some kind of rolling hill? Is it just like really flat? So that's a concept of linearity. And what we wanted to be able to look at was, are there biases in the generator, right? Are there certain kinds of levels that Launchpad is more likely to make than others? And so doing this kind of heat map analysis means we can see that yes, right? There are certain kinds of generating 20,000 levels. That's like kind of a lot of levels. So generating all of those levels, there are some levels that Launchpad has never made, right? It's never made a very low leniency, like middling linearity level, ever, out of 20,000. Whereas it's like actually really likely to make levels that are middling leniency and not very linear at all. And then it's got kind of like this wasteland in the middle, and then another peak over here, where it creates highly linear middling leniency levels. And we can see examples of what levels look like in each of these little bins, right? So this is an example of a low leniency, low linearity level. So it's rolling, but there's lots of gaps for the player to fall down. This is an example of a high linearity, low leniency level. Still lots of gaps for the player to fall down, but now you're like constantly going downhill in the entire level. And this is kind of a middling linearity, low leniency level, right? So it's sort of generally trending upwards, but there's kind of a rolling thing going on in the middle. And like still lots of gaps to fall down, but also plenty of like straightaways where you wouldn't fall and die. Or like here's a middling linearity, high leniency level. So there's really not many places for the player to... There's lots of challenges, but not many where the player would come to instant death when playing. What's interesting when we did this expressive range analysis is we were able to uncover biases in the generator based on the different parameters that we set. So these are all of the different... each map is a configuration of rhythm parameters sent to the generator. So you can tell the generator to create levels that are 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 or 20 seconds long. You can tell it to create levels with a regular beat, where the player is taking regular actions, where the player is taking random actions at random times, and where the player is taking actions with a beat that kind of resembles like a swing beat or a heartbeat. And then within that, you can tell it to create exclusively low density rhythms, exclusively high or like middling density rhythms. So a high density regular rhythm would be the player needing to take an action every half second. A low density regular rhythm would be the player needing to take an action every like 4 seconds. Right? So it's still regular, but the amount of time between is different. And what we were interested in looking at here was how changing those rhythm parameters changed the kind of content that the generator was capable of creating. So there's, in particular, in the regular beat type, a tendency to create very, very linear levels. And that tendency doesn't exist as much or as strong, nearly as strongly in random beats, or really even as strongly in swing beats. But swing has kind of the opposite problem where there's a lot of banding. It can't create very lenient or very non-lenient levels. It can only create like middling lenient levels. So this doesn't really... We were surprised by some of these results. Like we expected there to be variation in what we were capable of making, but we were surprised by some of the results that we saw because we really didn't want Launchpad to be biased towards creating highly linear levels. And it's not under a lot of different parameter settings. It's really only under like 3 or 4 of them that it's so heavily biased. And we were able to look back and tweak some of the rules that we use in the generator and run the expressive range analysis again to see what rules are contributing to this kind of effect. And we actually ended up narrowing this problem down to one decision that we'd made very early on in creating Launchpad, where we said, you know what happens a lot in human-created levels? There'll be repeated patterns of geometry. And so we said, well, we want there to be like a 50% probability that if the system's chosen a particular pattern of geometry, it'll choose that pattern again at some point later in the level. And that one decision is responsible for all of this biasing here. And the reason is actually an interaction effect in the rules that may be getting a bit too complex and nuanced to get into, but essentially like a combination of 3 different rules all being in effect at once and the physics of the world made it so that the system was much, much, much more likely to pick gaps that go down in these situations. And it was just like those 3 things together were like the thing that made that happen, that we never would have been able to know was going on without being able to do this kind of analysis. So I'm increasingly interested in doing this kind of evaluation work, not just to be able to evaluate a generator and be able to like tell a community or tell designers who want to use it, hey, this is what this generator can do, but also use it during the design and debugging process, right? Like, you know, I've added in this rule, what does it do now? I've added in these rules, what does it do now? And be able to do that in a more meaningful way than just like hit the generate button a bunch of times and spot check what you get out, right? Which I think, if we're being honest, is what a lot of us do when we do generative like design research, right? The other thing that we can do with this, and this is like the worst graph in the world and why I'm increasingly interested in information visualization techniques, is be able to compare different generators along different metrics and say certain generators are really good at creating certain kinds of levels and certain other generators are not as good at creating them. I don't need to go into a lot of detail with this graph because, as I said, it's horrendous. But essentially this is 12 different level generators that all create for the same domain, evaluating them along 7 different metrics. So there's a lot of open questions in being able to do this kind of expressivity analysis. What kinds of metrics does it make sense to use? Do we want to be evaluating individual levels? Do we want to be evaluating pairs of levels together to see how different they are from each other? How do we know that the metrics that we're choosing are valid, right? This is a static analysis approach to evaluation where we're making some pretty core assumptions about how these metrics will correlate to an actual player's experience. Like, is a middling leniency level actually medium difficulty, or are we just like making this up for no good reason? We grounded it in theory, right, but we haven't actually tested. How do we visualize results so that you don't have graphs that make people want to cry? And how does this apply to user-created content, which I think is like this interesting parallel to procedural content where it's got some of the same impact on design, where now you've got lots and lots of different pieces of content that have been created, and lots of them may be surprising and lots of them may be bad. So I think there's some interesting parallels there. So I want to close, because I know I've run a little bit over, for which I'm a bit sorry, but not that sorry, honestly. So I want to close, now that we've talked about what expressive design tools are and the 3 main components that I think are interesting, just talking about a couple of the things that I'm doing now, moving forward, and how I'm taking some of these ideas and applying them in different domains or for different reasons. So one project that I'm working on is a project called Viv. Viv is an AI system that attempts to model creative inspiration. So the idea is it can create 3D printable vases. So you're welcome to take a look at it if you want. This is the first prototype that we just got like 3 hours before I left Boston on Wednesday, hot off the presses research results. So Viv creates vases based on an input image. So you give the AI an image and you say, be inspired by this. What is the vase you would make being inspired by this? And so this is a vase that is intended to be very active. We're still figuring out the actual link up between image and vase. We know how we want to do it, but the code isn't there yet. But the idea is roughly that we can take the color palette of an image, so looking at dominant and salient colors in an image, look at color psychology theory for how people across cultures tend to react to different kinds of colors, where pretty much everyone's in agreement that red is a very warm and angry color, whereas blue is a very cool and peaceful color, and then there's sort of all kinds of things within that spectrum. and use that sort of expected human affective response to the colors that are in the image to inspire the vase that the AI system will create, that we then turn into an actual 3D printable concrete vase that you can get out at the end of that process. Printing that took about 45 minutes to print it. And the sculptor that we're working with on this project is like absurdly fascinated with it, actually, in part because he has no idea how he would make that himself out of clay. Right? You could carve it out of wood if it were a solid object, but the fact that it's hollow is actually what makes it really hard. So you would have to like make it in halves and then join the halves, and it would look really weird. So Viv is a fun project that we're working on right now. Fingers crossed we'll have something ready to be able to submit to conferences soon. Another project that we're working on is the Grace project. Grace is named for Grace Hopper, a pioneering woman computer scientist. This is looking at how we can use procedural content generation to teach computational thinking among communities of players. So we're generating puzzles. This is an NSF-funded project. We're generating puzzles that are based on concepts in computer science, specifically finding the minimum spanning tree of a graph for computer scientists in the room. And then looking at how we can generate puzzles based on concrete learning objectives that are controllably similar to each other, but also controllably dissimilar from each other. So that if we give the puzzle to the generated puzzles to a community of players, when you ask each other for help, what you end up needing to do is talk about generalizable strategies, which we're hoping will then map to sort of the beginnings of being able to think through algorithms. Right? So we're asking players, in the context of this game with procedurally generated puzzles, to be able to identify that the puzzles are similar to each other, that they're trying to solve similar problems, and then help each other sort of at a level of abstraction beyond just being able to give someone the answer to the puzzle. Right? So this is really enabled by being able to think about content generation from a controllable point of view, because we need to be able to control for very specific edge objectives. Other things that I'm interested in doing in the future, I actually just found a couple of students, I hope, to be able to work on this project. In my other life, I am a quilter and a sewer, and I do embroidery. And I've been embarking on a project for the last 8 months where every day I design a new quilt inspired by an image and the color palette from that image, in fact. There are parallels to Viv. And I'm interested in looking at sort of this big corpus of material that I and a bunch of other people now have, of like a lot of variation in how you can design quilts and be able to model that to a computer, so being able to generate quilt designs that are both aesthetically pleasing and actually possible to make, because quilting has a lot of constraints. And if you just like do applique, which is basically taking cut out pieces of fabric and sticking them on top of each other, you can do a lot more. But if you want to piece it, like basically all of the clothes that you're wearing with seams, right, then now you really need to care about how seams are going to line up and what order you're going to sew things in to be able to actually make it as a thing in the end that you could sleep under. Right? So there's some really interesting sort of geometric constraints there. And I'm also really interested in continuing this expressive range evaluation work. I'm interested in being able to visualize it in different ways. This is actually a clustering visualization of Launchpad's expressive range, but it's like not that obvious how it works. So I'm interested in having people be able to interactively explore the expressive range of a content generator. I'm interested in coming up with new metrics to be able to evaluate content generators, and interested in being able to use expressive range as a sort of a debugging tool within the game development process. So with that, thank you for sticking around. I'm very happy to answer any questions or chat further with people. So thank you.
more about how you think about it, because for me it's a really, like, the range is like a very relative thing, and like it can either be like the expression of the designer, the expression of the object itself, or the expression of the gameplay. And within all those things, it's a very personal thing in a way, where it sits within your own body of knowledge. For example, like, you could think about the expressiveness of a sunset, and we all get, like, if you've seen a sunset up in like the North Pole versus one on the equator, you can have very, like, you understand that range of things. So within this framework, like, how do you resolve like the different mindsets of the player and the author?
Yeah, I don't have a clean answer for that.
I don't expect
and this is part of what I was getting at, where like my art brain and my design brain conflict on this a little bit as well, because you also said like it's a very personal thing and a very subjective thing.
But how do you start to like what's your inroad for it? Like, what's your first thing that you want to think about? Is it the object, or is it the author, or is it the player?
So for me, I think it's the object, and I think it's the relationship between the system that produces the object and the objects that can be produced. So it's getting a little bit at the author, but from a very objective standpoint, right? So we were talking actually at lunch about the software that you, even as a human designer, right, the software that you use has a massive impact on what you're actually creating, right? There was an article I read recently about parameterized design software for architecture, and the fact that like most modern buildings that go up now are very obviously created in a particular piece of software for architectural design. And it's what gets you like you know these buildings, right? It's like the flowing curve thingy, like the really tall, like organic shape thing. All of those buildings are designed in the same piece of software, right? So I think that's the piece that I'm interested in, right? Is how the technology that you're using, and I mean technology very broadly, because you could also look at the expressive range of like charcoal versus paint, right? But the relationship between how the technology you're using works and what you can create with it.
So with that in mind, do you think that when we make like PCG content, do you think it's important to tell the player that it's generated?
It depends on the design context, right? So in Endless Web, I can tell you one of the things we've struggled against in playtesting and have been worked a lot to refine was players were not explicitly told that they were part of the generation process. Players could kind of tell that something weird was going on, but the changes that they were making to the world were subtle enough that outside of the first time you do it, like as you get deeper into the generative space, the changes that you make are like incrementally more subtle. And it's almost like in theater, right? A lighting designer's job in most traditional theatrical productions is to never be noticed, right? If you've done lighting design badly, then people will notice. If you've done it right, then people will not notice, right? Because it's like seamlessly integrated into the experience of the actors and the audience, and it like highlights all the things that need to be highlighted, right? So, but there are other forms of theater where lighting is like such a core component of it, or like music shows, right? Where like lighting is like one of the big things that people see. So it's really context dependent. I personally am more interested in the kind of content generation. Most of the time, I'm more interested in the kind of content generation that players don't know is going on.
Because in like we've got games like No Man's Sky coming out, and like Spelunky, where like the main marketing message is PCG.
Yeah.
And
there's a game called Desert Golfing,
Oh, okay.
People were really, really debating, and I still don't think there's an answer, because there's thousands and thousands of levels, but they're very simple levels. In theory, someone could have made them by hand, but it was almost like people discussing religion.
Yeah.
Like whether there was a guiding hand that had placed these.
Yeah.
I found that really interesting.
Yeah, one of the things that I didn't get to in the talk, I've been doing a sort of history research project almost, where I've been looking at the history of content generation in games and how it's changed over time. And yeah, part of it is definitely, one of the changes has actually been when talking about games, whether you actually say that it's generated or not, and how that's part of the marketing message for the game has changed a little bit. In the indie community, I feel like procedural content generation is such a big thing now, and something that's so interesting to lots of people, that players really, especially for sort of roguelike style games, like that's such a core part of the experience. But I think a lot of the time it's kind of used as a code word for you don't know what you're going to see next, right? Which could happen because of procedural content generation, or it could happen because of something else. And on some level, who really cares if a human designed 10,000 levels or the computer did it, right? To the player, this is presumably going to be the same kind of experience.
It's funny though, because within that, there's that really changes our expectations of the games and what the game can actually be. So when you were talking about that idea where a designer specifies that you see a mountain at a particular time, like a mountaintop from a particular vantage point, and the way that you look at that image gives the player certain expectations for what's to come. Like in Journey, at the beginning of the game, you see the glowing mountaintop, and it's like, oh, I clearly have to go there, and we're constantly reminded that that's where you go. And within PCG, can we design around stuff like that? Can you give it can we create these more linear experiences within these things where it's like going from A to B with these kind of set pieces within? I mean, the answer is obviously yes.
Yes. I think that's an active area of research as well. I think it's not a way that procedural content generation is currently being explored in games. And it's a way that I wish content generation would be explored more in games. Right? I think, and I really want to push beyond this very flawed, in my mind, replayability argument. There's no reason to believe that PCG will magically grant your game replayability, or that is by any means the best we have to hope for from what content generation can accomplish. But it's not the dominant rhetoric of content generation in games right now, I feel like. Maybe someday. And there is use of content generation, so Skyrim has generated terrain. Right? A human didn't go in and author that entire terrain environment. A computer did a lot of it, and then humans tweaked the bits around story content and very specific designed experiences. But a lot of what's in between is procedurally generated. But Skyrim doesn't get marketed as a procedural content generation game. Right? It's marketed as an open world sandboxy role playing game. Where the content generation was really used as a tool by the designers, not as something that the players actually interact with. And games where the player gets to interact with the content generation in some way are largely still sort of roguelike style things. I think we can do interesting things and push the boundaries of that.
I thought that the other point that you made about the initial design constraints that you give it had producing massive biases is kind of partially what Gamergate is about. And it's a real it's such an important idea of what are the what are our expectations of games, and within queer theory we're looking at the essence of what things are and the assumptions of what makes a thing, and or what makes a person. So within this, I kind of wonder what constraints did you give the system? What assumptions do you think are embedded in this that are, like, were there other ones that you found were, like, producing, like, that were amplified and turned into, like, other undesirable results?
I'm trying to remember back to that project. I feel like that was really the big one. In making Endless Web, it became clear that the arguments that we've been making about the kind of variety of what the system could produce, the kind of variety we were getting was varied, but it was not interestingly varied. And so we changed how Launchpad works to try to introduce more interesting and meaningful variety that players would be able to identify. But I think to me the interesting part of the expressive range was the site, because we all know that, like, what's interesting about content generation is the emergent stuff that comes out from all of these different rules, and you get, like, surprising things, but being able to actually characterize and understand that process in some way, I think is interesting.
Going on with those particular dimensions, linearity and the leniency, that's a fascinating design of PCG.
Yeah.
And it's then that you're going to kind of close that loop as well.
There's so many loops to be closed. So actually this semester, one of my colleagues, Alessandro Canosa, is teaching a level design class. And he, as part of his level design class, asked students to make Mario-style levels that were supposed to target a particular desired emotion that they wanted the player to feel when playing. And he did I always forget the person, it's like a famous like intensity of experience versus valence emotion. So you can have, like, high intensity positive emotions, low intensity positive emotions, high intensity negative, low intensity negative. And so students in that class, this is an undergrad level class, students in the class were assigned to different quadrants of that chart, and so a group of students were told to make high intensity positive emotion levels, and a group were told make low intensity positive, and so on. And then students, after the fact, we went in and actually asked students to try to use the metrics that we've already come up with to be able to say, what bearing do you think these metrics have on the levels that you're making? And then also try to define new ones that you feel capture something that is in common between the levels that you made trying to target this particular emotion. And a lot of the ones that we got out were actually around color palette, so intensity of colors that were chosen. So in actual art asset selection, right, whether you're choosing to make it using the underground Mario tile set or the above ground Mario tile set or with the starry background or the light blue background. And students were playing with tiles from different tile sets to be able to combine them, and almost all of them did something where, like, the low intensity positive emotion all had, like, a very dark background, because it feels a bit more peaceful and a bit less, like, energetic, right? Like, they were all aiming for, like, very low energy kinds of things, and a lot of it came out through the color palettes that they had, and how varied the colors were. So, like, the high intensity positive emotion people who were going for, like, exciting stuff. One of the students was aiming for, like strong male testosterone level, and so she had this thing where, like, you, like, rush downhill through, like, there's a bunch of fire all around you, and then you, like, go uphill and there's a bunch of fire all around you, and you're shooting fireballs the whole time. And so we were trying to sort of identify what aspects were going into creating those kinds of experiences. So yeah, we're doing some work trying to come up with different metrics. But there's so many that you have, and then you hit the visualization problem, right? Once I've got all of these metrics to be able to, like, define the expressivity of a system in, like, this n-dimensional metric space, how do you portray that information to the user in a way that makes any kind of sense? It's a really hard problem.
The things you were saying about quilts towards the end were interesting. Is it possible to 3D print quilts, as it were? Is it possible to automatically stitch them?
To a limited extent, right? So, quilts, no. This requires me to pull out the different elements of quilting, right? So, so in creating this, which incidentally, this design that I did is based on 7 different quotes from one of my favorite books of all time. I've been very big on the inspiration part of creativity lately. Apparently, I didn't even realize until I was putting this talk together. So this quilt, the actual design elements, you would need to piece in some way or applique in some way. That part cannot really be very easily automated. You could do a thing where you could laser cut. So I've thought a lot about how much you can automate this, by the way. So you could laser cut the pieces, right? Which actually would cauterize the edge of the fabric so it wouldn't fray. I'm pretty sure, 90% sure. It would also change what it looks like a little bit at the edges. But you could do that, and then you could, as a human, lay out the pieces on the quilt top, essentially gluing them down with a washable glue, so it would come out when you wash it. And then you could procedurally stitch over all of it to be able to glue it all together. You couldn't really easily program one of the big long-arm quilting machines to stitch around the edges, but you could do an all-over stitch that would basically pin everything down.
Isn't the medium craft here the fact that you're actually making a quilt yourself? It's the design.
It depends. It completely depends, right? So I am interested in all options. Right? I am interested in the design of the quilt pattern that a human would then execute upon, but I am also interested, in the same way that I'm interested in the design of a vase that a human would then try to sculpt on a wheel, or throw on a wheel, right, as a target for them to achieve, and then what they achieved when making it would be different from the pattern, but that's okay, because the pattern itself is an inspiration for what you make. But I'm also interested in being able to 3D print them and go all the way to completion with automation. And these are different research goals and artistic goals that I have in my mind when I think about it. But yeah, so there are computerized embroidery machines that are programmable in a way, but the state of technology in that space is so sad. And there are computerized quilting machines. So these are a quilt, you piece the top, and then you sandwich the top to a layer of batting, which can be cotton or wool or silk or whatever, to a bottom layer, and then stitch through all 3 of those layers. That is actually quilting. That is what the term to quilt means, is that step of the process. That can be done by a computerized machine. But the piecing, no.
It sounds very complicated. It's interesting, but then also interesting what you said about different people.
Yeah, I think what's interesting to me about patterns is the idea that then there's variability in what a human can make on top of it. So every quilter I know will tweak patterns in some way. You'll start out by making, especially if you're a novice, you'll just follow the instructions perfectly. It's almost like paint by numbers, right? Cut out piece X, cut out piece Y, sew X to Y, and you keep going. But as you get more experience in the field, you'll always tweak it in some way. I want it to fit an unusually sized baby crib, or baby crib, not baby. Maybe an unusually sized baby. I don't know. Or I want it to be So I've actually had to do this. My husband is incredibly tall, and so when I make quilts to use on the couch or something, it needs to be a good foot longer than most patterns will give you, just to be able to cover his feet. So there's a lot of tweaking that people do to patterns, and then that's almost another layer of expressivity. Of indirection and expressivity of a system, right? You design.
In the world, sorry.
No.
In the world of gaming, there's PCG used to inspire designers.
Well, Tanagra was trying to do that a little bit. It was trying to be.
I'm really sorry. I've got this room booked for 3:30.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you again.
Yeah, thank you.